and that wonderful scene between the two of them. Again, please pardon me for my poor impression of Chris Isaac, my poor Chris Isaac impression. I hope you can forgive me, but I love that line he says to Sheriff Cable. He says, your behavior's not funny. It's wasting the time of the federal government.
One take, one take, one take, one
Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And let us continue on with our discussion of this wonderful work, which is from 1992, directed by David Lynch, which is called Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. Now, before we continue on, I should point out once again that I do not hold myself out to be in any way an expert when it comes to the world of Twin Peaks and when it comes to this particular film. So I'm going to get a number of the details wrong during my discussion. I will try not to, but in the event that I do make mistakes, please pardon me. I apologize in advance for those. I don't mean any ill will at all towards the world of Twin Peaks. In fact, that's my way too of saying that I am a huge fan. I'm a huge admirer of this world, Twin Peaks, of this work, Twin Peaks, and indeed of this film, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. I find this film to be so hypnotic, so enthralling, one of the most epic and intimate and emotionally powerful works in the canon of David Lynch, let alone as a representation of stories in the world of Twin Peaks. So it is my great pleasure and honor to be able to talk a little bit about this truly remarkable work of art. And one more thing too, which is we are going through the discussions of this film pretty much in sort of chronological order. And then at the end of this discussion series on this YouTube channel, I plan to try to do some kind of wrap up. So there will be a number of videos talking about Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. Please note that during the course of discussion, I may refer back to any episodes that have occurred from the pilot through seasons 1 and 2 of the TV show Twin Peaks, because as we know, that has been broadcast prior to the release of this film. And so I think that my discussions will be pretty much premised on the knowledge of the events that have occurred in the pilot and season 1 and season 2 in those episodes. So this discussion may touch upon things that we have seen in prior episodes. However, please note that I will not directly refer to anything that has occurred after this film. So I won't be referring to any other stories, any missing pieces, any return parts, etc. Those will be discussions for another day. So please do not worry if you have not yet seen any future episodes or parts or stories of Twin Peaks. Our discussions will be probably containing comments or topics included in this film, and perhaps touching upon episodes that we have seen up to this film, but not anything afterwards. So please keep that in mind in case you want to keep track in terms of your own initial Twin Peaks journey throughout these particular stories leading up to, of course, this film, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. And so with that, my dear friends, let us continue on. So last time we left off, we were talking about the journey of Special Agents Chet Desmond and Sam Stanley to Deer Meadow. And we understand Deer Meadow is in Washington State, and we have to understand too that this is the place where Teresa Banks' body has been found, Wind River, and so they have to go and liaison and meet with the local authorities there, and that means the sheriff's office, and they have to meet, of course, Deputy Cliff and Sheriff Cable. Sheriff Cable, Ben Steele, we see a little picture of that there on the wall, which is a very interesting detail. Now, before I go on, I should point out too, well, actually, it might be good to talk about this in the context of Deer Meadow, because when we go to Deer Meadow and we go to the sheriff's station, I think we can already get a sense of things that feel similar yet different. Now, I touched upon this in the previous discussion on Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, about how things feel somewhat similar there might be some tones or images or maybe signals or maybe character situations and the like that might recall some kind of feeling of similarity towards the series Twin Peaks. So, for instance, the appearance of Gordon Cole, for example, the mentioning of Sam Stanley, for example, and the like. However, there are differences as well. And those differences, I think, echo in a way that resonate very strongly. It is, of course, to give some kind of unique individual character to this film, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, almost a way to signal to us, the viewers, that this film is standing on itself independently. However, there are also, I think, some resonances that I think have a certain thematic significance in terms of the feeling of not quite deja vu, similar things yet different things. Now, what do I mean by this? Case in point, when we get to the Deer Meadow Sheriff Station, we are automatically, I think, or I feel automatically, somewhat reminded of, say, the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department. And we, of course, know that Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department is one of the most central and significant environments in the story of Twin Peaks for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, being that we see this is the cross section of the number of main characters in the story of Twin Peaks: Sheriff Truman, Special Agent Dale Cooper, Andy, Hawk, Lucy, etc. And it's, of course, therefore, a place of warmth and welcoming. And it's a place that we as viewers want to go because these are characters that we have come to know and indeed love and cherish because they are so welcoming, they are so endearing, they're so lovable, and they're so caring. And they care about each other. And that's one of the great strengths of Twin Peaks. Now, when we get to Deer Meadow, in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, there are certain similarities. There's someone who's sitting at the desk who even looks like Lucy. There's the deputy, Deputy Cliff, and of course we are reminded perhaps of Hawk and Andy. However, there is a difference. There is a significant difference. There is a type of belligerence. There's a type of resistance. There's almost a type of volatility, and there's a hesitancy, and there's an antagonism towards these visitors. Sam Stanley, who is sitting very, almost very straight and erect posture on the sofa there. Of course, we understand later he's counting and he's calculating in his head how much this office costs, including furniture, $27,000, which is a very interesting figure. Now, we of course know that Deputy Cliff, and company here, they are laughing, they are joking. We understand that they're joking at the expense of Chet Desmond. And we understand also that, they're making jokes about the coffee. The coffee was fresh 2 days ago, and they're just laughing and they're making nonsense. But it's also a type of antagonism, and it's something that is very off-putting and almost very maybe out of scene in a way, because it's very much not welcoming. It's almost even threatening. And we have this sense of this world that is very cold and it's not welcoming indeed, which is in many ways the polar opposite of the world of Twin Peaks. So there's this idea of similar yet difference that we see almost immediately when we enter the world of Deer Meadow. Now, I should also point out this idea of things that feel similar yet different. When we talk too about the character of Chet Desmond, we are, of course, reminded perhaps a little bit of a type of echo of the Special Agent Dale Cooper, the great character, Special Agent Dale Cooper, that we have met, of course, throughout the course of the story Twin Peaks since the pilot. And so now we are come to meet this character, Chet Desmond, essentially for the first time. And for the time being, of course, Chet Desmond is, or seems to be, the lead character of this particular story that takes him to Deer Meadow and the investigation involving the death of Teresa Banks. Now, this would therefore, I think, lead us to the possibility of looking at Chet Desmond as a kind of almost similar yet different in terms of comparing his character to that of Dale Cooper. I mean, there's a sense of a look and a style about him in terms of his fashion sense. I mean, he's wearing the trench coat, he's got the suit and tie, and he's got the hair that's very styled. and he has a certain manner of speaking, and he has a sense of control about him. We see that, of course, for instance, how he's handling Deputy Cliff with the nose over there and the like, trying to make his way into the office of Sheriff Gabe. How the heck did you get in here? And the like. So this becomes a very, I think, interesting type of parallel to that character of Dale Cooper. There are, of course, differences as well. And so we get this sense, I think, of a world that, again, feels similar yet different. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is also because of course, we have to mention, of course, the idea of the links or lack thereof between this story and the TV series that we have seen up to season 2. But also, in the course of Twin Peaks, in the stories that we have seen, for instance, in seasons 1 and 2, and maybe in some future stories that we might see subsequent to this story, and I'll end it there in terms of specificity, we may get this sense of, or I think we've already gotten the sense of, some stories or some aspects of Twin Peaks that we are entering worlds that have a sense of similarity or feeling of similarity, but there's also a sense of discomfort, a sense of dread, a sense of the unknown, maybe deja vu all over again. But that deja vu all over again, that type of repetition, that type of a parallel beat that seems to be something that is, say, rhyming with something that has occurred elsewhere back in time, there is a sense of an echo, and the sense of an echo or repetition, while at the same time feeling different or feeling distinct from that which has gone before, gives us a sense of, I think, not just dread and unknown, but even perhaps a sense of a subtle and nuanced creepiness. So a case in point, I think, for instance, in seasons 1 and 2, we have seen instances where things and actions have repeated to the point of almost a sense of eeriness. So, for instance, when we think about the story of Laura Palmer and what happens to Laura Palmer, we also have this sense, and we saw that in terms of doppelgangers and doubles, things that actions have been repeated. For instance, meeting someone who looks like Laura Palmer at the gazebo. Of course, this is Maddie with a wig. And so this is a repeated action, but it's a similar but not quite the same. There's, of course, the actions that happen with respect to the character of Maddie in season 2, actions that I think are very shocking and very startling, and they remind us of things that have happened in the course of Twin Peaks and the story of Laura Palmer, what happens to her, parallel actions that happen with Laura Palmer and Maddie as an example. There are similarities and yet there are differences, and those differences, I think, trigger the plot propulsion forward. Of course, that leads to, I think, some really key elements that we've seen in season 2, for example. Now, that type of feeling of similarity yet difference, I think, is, of course, very important, because also Twin Peaks has, I think, a lot to do with the sense of almost parallel worlds and even dimensions and things that are existing in different planes of existences, different dimensions, different spaces, and perhaps also multiple personalities. And I mentioned the word doppelganger, and this is very important too when we think of the character or the presence or the almost the dangerous presence of a character like Bob, and what happens with respect to Bob and Dale Cooper at the end of season 2, for example. So the sense of doubles or parallel action. And of course, even we're reminded of something like, say, the final episode in season 29, when we're going in, say, rooms and rooms and rooms in a place called the Black Lodge, or it's referred to as the Black Lodge. We're repeating actions, but that repeating action in that particular sequence reveals slightly different details that I think peel back layers that reveal something utterly and truly frightening. So that sense of dread and unknown, something feels similar and yet completely different. That leads to a sense of unease. And in fact, fright and scares as well, that of course lead also to the thrilling. And I think that is touched upon in these echoes that we see immediately in the opening sequences of Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. We see it, for instance, in the way in which Deer Meadow seems like Twin Peaks and yet it's not. And we see it also in the echoes of details, the way that the body of Teresa Banks floats down the river. It feels similar yet different. We've heard these names before, and yet they are also presenting some different language or action as well. So this, I think, is something that's very akin, very much part of the world and fabric of Twin Peaks. And dare I say it, we might see this as well play itself out in future episodes and future stories. So let's keep this in mind. Things that feel similar yet different, causing perhaps a sense of fright and dread because of the unknown factor. Now, before I go on, I should say too that I love the scene between Chet Desmond and Sheriff Cable in the office, and of course you see all the trinkets and the things on the wall and the pictures and the big thing there, and that wonderful scene between the two of them. Again, please pardon me for my poor impression of Chris Isaac, my poor Chris Isaac impression. I hope you can forgive me, but I love that line he says to Sheriff Cable. He says, "Your behavior's not funny. It's wasting the time of the federal government." And so this is, again, things that feel similar yet different. Of course, we have a meeting between an FBI agent and the local sheriff, but much, much, much different than that meeting between Sheriff Truman and Special Agent Dale Cooper, is it not? I mean, these two probably are not going to be close associates and close friends like Harry Truman and Dale Cooper were. And so there will be no Bookhouse Boys, there will be no bait exchange. There will be no, heart-to-heart talk. There will be no gift to oneself of cups of coffee, etc. At least that's the implication, because the reception between Sheriff Cable and Special Agent Chet Desmond is indeed a very, very cold one and a very unwelcoming one. So welcome to a world of similarities yet differences in this place called Deer Meadow. Now that, of course, then brings us to the morgue scene and the entrance to the morgue scene. And this is, of course, the reference that Sam Stanley brings up about how he notices, or he surmises, that this place, including furniture, is probably worth $27,000. Now, this is a very eccentric detail of Sam Stanley, and you notice that Chet Desmond's looking at him like, what the heck are you talking about? That sort of thing. Now, this is probably perhaps a type of indication too of the character of Sam Stanley. He's observing things slightly different. Now, we also understand that in the pilot, Dale Cooper mentions to Diane that he doesn't want to work with Sam Stanley. So maybe this type of, say, eccentric comment from Sam Stanley might be an indication as to why Dale Cooper feels the way that he does, or we assume that he feels the way that he does about Sam Stanley. And we get a sense too that Chet Desmond is maybe not feeling it as well. I mean, Chet Desmond is also very friendly, don't get me wrong. We'll talk about it, that scene between the two of them in Hap's Diner a little bit later, but there's a little bit of an indication, dare I say it, a real indication, that maybe Sam Stanley's character is not necessarily on the same plane as the other characters that but no matter. And he could be right too. Maybe it is worth the $27,000, furniture included. But in any event, we go to the details of Teresa Banks and the investigation of the body. Please note, before we go further, the clock. There is, I think, a very purposeful close-up of the clock. Now, what time is it on the clock, do we say? It says 4:30. It says 4:30. Now, of course, we know that this is a significant time because just prior, Sheriff Cable mentioned that I think they close at 5. But, of course, that won't stop Chet Desmond and Sam Stanley from working all through the evening and late hours and the early morning hours until about, I think it's 3:30 or so the following morning. It's late. No, it's early. So they work very hard. But note here, when they first start working in the morgue, the close-up on the clock indicates the time of 4:30. Now, I mention this because in the world of Twin Peaks, especially, or for example, in the world of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, we see close-ups of numbers. Now, we've seen this references to numbers in various numbers, perhaps in certain episodes here and there throughout the pilot or throughout the seasons 1 and 2, the TV show up to now. But I would just invite you, my dear friends, to consider the possibilities and consider all the numbers that appear And say in close-ups, let's say there's going to be some numbers that we will see a little bit later on a electricity pole at the Fat Trout trailer park as well. And a number of numbers, including a number 6, which may or may not seem significant. Now, also keep in mind too 4:30. Now, we may or may not see or get reference to the time 4:30 later in the journey that we call Twin Peaks in future stories. Who knows? But in any event, let us keep this in mind. So there is the sense of time and also the sense of numbers, which may or may not have a type of grand universal significance. But in any event, this also gives way to the scene of the two of them, Sam Stanley and Chet Desmond, continuing on with their inquiries and investigations, which now involves the examination of the corpse. This is a very grisly scene. This is a very tough scene because we see the dead body, the dead corpse of Teresa Banks with the face and the eyes open, and of course the body is now it is lifeless, and it is cold, and the mouth is open, revealing this dead woman, this victim, this poor victim. And we now see that they are investigating. There are some injuries that Sam Stanley seems to be able to recognize as the probable cause of death, injuries to the head. And they also note too that no next of kin, she was alone. Again, differences from the way that Laura Palmer and her death affected an entire community of Twin Peaks. And remember the discovery of Laura Palmer's body and the fight in terms of how her body would be treated at the morgue, in terms of Doc Hayward and Albert, etc., in terms of the funeral arrangements. Remember those very dramatic and emotional scenes in the TV series. Well, here we have a morgue scene, but it seems to be very far from those emotional heartstring moments. Indeed, there is a sense of loneliness. There's a sense of this young girl being quite alone, and it also paints, I think, a very distinct and different, and perhaps also a tragic and sad tone as well. We get the close-ups on the face and the eyes and the like, and this lifeless body, which I think augments and really brings home the fact that this is also a story of real difficult brutality and violence, and it's a world that's very scary indeed. And I think this type of moment reminds us of this. There's a chill in the air, and I think that chill in the air again gives us a sense that this is again a very dangerous and sad world indeed. Now again, this idea of similarities versus differences, I'd also point out that, remember, this is we understand that this is taking place in February 1988, so approximately 1 year before the events that take place in Twin Peaks, starting with the pilot into season 1 and season 2 and the like. So, but we also understand that the killing of Laura Palmer and there was also, of course, the idea of the letter that was under the fingernail, which is a very grisly detail, and we recall this from the episodes from the earlier seasons. And here we get the reveal of how the letter, the T, I think, is stuck underneath the fingernail there. And it's a very grisly detail. They kind of peel it back, which I always find very disturbing. It is a very far cry from how the letter is revealed from the fingernail of the body of Laura Palmer. If you're here, we get a very distinct and grisly detail. So again, similarities but differences, and those differences strike a very, I think, bitter chord, reminding us that this is indeed a very bitter and startling and very violent world indeed. But it is one that, again, these people, these agents, Sam Stanley and Chet Desmond, need to engage with in order to, in a sense, carry out this idea of justice. And the idea of justice is, who killed Teresa Banks? And this is one of the questions that perhaps we will pursue further as we go forward into this world of Twin Peaks and the like. So there is, of course, so many things at stake when it comes to this. Now, the next scene, as we know, is going to take us to Hap's Diner because it's again, it's 3:30. It's late. No, 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 it's not late. It's early, and so they go to Hap's Diner and to get something to eat, but also because they know that Teresa Banks had a, connection there. So this idea of going there and meeting Irene. I love meeting Irene. Of course, there are many Irenes in the world of David Lynch. We there was Irene also in Twin Peaks, and I just want to point out here one of my dear favorite works of David Lynch, Mulholland Drive. Okay, Irene, won't that be the day? And so, but there's a very different chord that's struck, I think, when we meet Irene from Hap's Diner. But there's again a sense of a type of roughness about it, almost a sense of unwelcoming behavior. This is again a very far cry, perhaps, from the double R, and and Norma and Shelley, right? But what's so interesting, I think, about a character like Irene is that she's no nonsense, but she does not resist talking to, in particular, Chet Desmond about the questions that he is asking about Teresa Banks and how she worked there. And so we have the notion here of she seems a bit rough. She seems a bit unwelcoming. Again, do you want to know about her specials? We don't have any. So there aren't any specials. There aren't even any specials at Hap's Diner during this time. But she doesn't resist asking or answering the questions, right? And so she does reveal some information about Teresa Banks. For example, she is very forthcoming about a little bit later in that scene about how she noticed that sometime before, Teresa Banks's arm went completely numb, which is a very peculiar detail to bring up for a number of reasons, I think. Well, first of all, this idea of the numbed arm, it does perhaps give us a sense of the echo of, remember what we saw towards the end of season 2, and certain people's activities when they're eating pie and suddenly their hand is shaking or trembling. That includes Pete. That includes a little bit of Dale Cooper as well. And so this perhaps remind us of the tingle. In fact, also there's a moment earlier when Harold Smith, when he's trying to reach out, his hand also shakes in that very similar way. So that may or may not have something to do with this little detail that Irene is revealing. We should point out too that perhaps the numbness of arms is something that we might see even later over the course of, say, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. So let's keep this detail in mind. I think it's very interesting. I also forgot to detail earlier in the earlier scene at the morgue. I forgot to mention, of course, that we mentioned fingers and we mentioned arms here. I mentioned fingers and the fingernails in that previous scene. We should also keep in mind too that there seems also to be a mark on her hand that indicates that perhaps she was wearing a ring. Teresa Banks was wearing a ring, but we don't know what that ring is, and we're not sure where it is. We're not sure what that ring means or signifies, at least at this point in the film. So I'm sorry, that's a detail that we should keep in mind because it might come up a little bit later. Of course, rings is a thing that rings are things that are very important in the world of Twin Peaks. But the other thing too, which is, or the number of things too about Hap's Diner, which is very, very significant, are first of all too, we have the continuing sense that Sam Stanley is a little bit annoying. Maybe innocently so, but of course when we're talking about drugs and of course this cocaine, this is a reminder too that the story of Twin Peaks is also a story about drugs and a type of a network of drug ring and drug smuggling. And of course that had something to do with Laura Palmer and her involvement in that particular story. And Bobby, etc. But now we also have the introduction of drugs in the story of Teresa Banks, or the implication or the guess that perhaps she was doing drugs. And of course, this leads to the conversation with Sam Stanley about nicotine is a drug, caffeine is a drug. So that's a really annoying comment from Sam Stanley, which might also be an indication as to why Dale Cooper perhaps doesn't really like him as much. But it's playfully annoying. I say annoying. I'm not so annoyed by that comment. It's just, I think, playfully annoying, which is something that I think what happens next with Chet Desmond and What's the Time, and it makes Sam Stanley spill his coffee into his lap. It's an interesting moment. But of course, note too that Chet Desmond says he's sorry. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So that's also an indication that maybe Chet Desmond has a little bit more sympathy towards Sam Stanley than perhaps Dale Cooper does. But in any event, it's Chet Desmond is a fascinating character, and he's also a really great detective, I think. And you can tell from his line of questioning here with Irene. He is getting information from Irene. This idea of the drug habit, this idea of the arm getting numb, and also the idea of there are no specials at Haps. So I should also point out too that also there are on the at the counter there, the diner counter, there's also the elderly gentleman with a young woman, and the young woman seems to be speaking in French. La nuit est le bon moment. I think that's what she says in French. Now, this is also very interesting to recall where else in the world of Twin Peaks we heard French being spoken. Now, I'm referring to some words that were spoken by a young boy who were identified, and with his grandmother, who were identified as the Tremons when. The Meals on Wheels, what was it? Je une solitaire, I am a lonely soul. And we also saw that phrase in the context of the death of Harold Smith and Deputy Andy. Of course, he's able to remember that. And of course, that brings Donna to the fore, and she recalls and she puts two and two together in terms of the Tremons and Harold Smith, J&M Solitaire. So there seems to be this way in which perhaps the mentioning of French, anything in the French language, may or may not have a certain significance. So let's just keep that in mind. We may also meet characters or people or personages or cameos that are French or that are speaking French or that have a sort of connection with France. Let's keep that in mind too, perhaps going forward in future stories. We may or may not. Who knows? Who knows? But in any event, it seems like an interesting detail, again, in this world of Deer Meadow and Hap's Diner. So there's a lot going on here. Touched upon. Again, similarities and differences, I think, are a key. Also, the way in which Sam Stanley's character is very subtly being introduced to us as well. Also, Chet Desmond and his detective skills. I think we are really drawn to Chet Desmond. I certainly am. I think Chet Desmond is a really cool character. Chris Isaak is playing this character so well, and with such a sense of cool and panache. It makes me want to see more of him in action. And so we will see him in action, of course, in scenes that will appear immediately after this diner scene in Hap's Diner, of course.